Hi, everybody. So it is almost 7 o'clock on Tuesday night, and I want to talk to you about how to conduct a rhetorical analysis. But it's late, and I need to get this to you before tomorrow. So I'm going to do it just extemporaneously, the way that I would if I were in a classroom. So I want you to open up to page 31 of the Essay Survival Kit, and you'll see there an article from the Chronicle of Higher Education. And the name of the article is We Know What Works in Teaching Composition. So after this lecture, I recommend that you read the article. But first thing I want to point out is that to understand the nature of this text, it's important to understand where it was published and who the intended audience was. So the Chronicle of Higher Education is a journal that costs like $300 a year to subscribe to. So I don't subscribe to it, but I think the university does, and it's specifically designed for faculty who teach at colleges and universities. And it publishes articles and studies and opinion pieces designed to support faculty members who want to successfully teach students or who want to know what to be worried about. You know, right now they're publishing stories about what might happen on college campuses in the fall. But knowing who the audience is critical to understanding the nature of the article. And then as you look through it, you can also look at how the author is addressing the audience. What type of language do they use? What kind of references do they make? Who are the sources that they use to support their claims? How do they frame an opinion with support? That kind of thing. So how do they give themselves credibility? How do they give their sources credibility? So I've got the whole article in here, and then some questions. Who's the writer? You've already been practicing that. So you want to look at a little background. It's important to know who Helen Keller is, what her background is, in order to understand her essay Optimism. If you don't know that she was blind and deaf and mute and couldn't speak until Anne Sullivan helped her learn how to read, how to speak, how to form ideas, how to structure her ideas, then that essay isn't nearly as moving. If you don't know who the Dalai Lama is, if you don't know who Tal Ben-Shahar is, if you don't know who Aristotle is, none of those pieces will be as meaningful. So you want to kind of anchor each of them in a historic moment. Helen Keller was, when was that piece written? Was it in 1904, I think? Dalai Lama is contemporary, but he comes from this long historic lineage of sort of sacred people in Tibet. And Aristotle is an ancient philosopher. Son, is he Greek or Roman? Roman? My child stepped out. Wasn't he Roman? See, if I were going to write about him, you think he was Greek? All right, well, see, if I were going to write about him, I'd need to double check and make sure I knew. And same thing with, let's see, Tal Ben-Shahar, Aristotle, Helen Keller, and the Dalai Lama. Those are our four. So you want to know who they are, and you want to, in your intro, you want to introduce them, literally introduce them. That's what the intro is for, is to introduce your central figures, your central text. It's to bring your audience into the conversation. And it's just as critical in a rhetorical analysis as it is in anything else. So what is the subject of your text? You're going to want to try to figure out what your writer's thesis statement is. And it's not always going to be at the end of the first paragraph like it is in an academic essay. So again, there are different types of writing. And in a creative piece, a poem, a short story, a novel, you're not going to have that clearly stated thesis at the end of the first paragraph. But you're going to look for it in these four pieces and see if you can figure out what it is the writer wants from you. What is their thesis statement? What do they want to persuade you of? What is their subject? Who is the audience? We've already talked about that. For me, I've had the most success with figuring out audience by looking at where something was published. So I'm not sure where Helen Keller's original optimism piece was published, but if I were going to write about that piece, I would do some research and see if I couldn't figure out was it in like the Saturday Evening Post, or was it in a newspaper, or was it in a medical journal? All of those things tell you something. What's the purpose of the text? And again, this has to do with what the author wants from you. And sometimes, you know, the subject and the purpose can be a little bit different. So you might be writing about how to make dinner, but your purpose is really to educate people on health and well-being, right? So they can be slightly different. What is the genre? And we've talked about that before. So genre, you want to distinguish between fiction and nonfiction. All of these are nonfiction. Um, they're opinion pieces, right? They're not based on scientific studies. They're based on experience, wisdom, um, thinking through an idea and supporting claims to persuade your audience of your position on something. I think that's what all of these authors were trying to do. What is the exigence? And again, that's the urgency. What's the inspiration or the urgency for the writing? And what is the context? And again, that can be a historical context or a biographical context. So important again to know what was going on with Helen Keller at that time. What was she fighting on a personal, social, national, global level? Same with the Dalai Lama. Same with Aristotle and with Tal Ben-Shahar. So identify 3 ways the author persuades the reader. So that is the central focus of conducting a rhetorical analysis. You want to look at how the author is using language, which is persuasive, always persuasive. How are they using that persuasive language to convince you to share their point of view? And in the end, you may or may not share their point of view, but in a rhetorical analysis, whether or not you share their point of view is irrelevant until the conclusion. And in the conclusion, you can tell me whether or not they persuaded you. But for the body of the paper, for the majority of the paper, all you're really going to be doing is analyzing how they tried to convince you. I don't care yet whether or not you agree. So we're going to keep our opinion out of it until the end. So here we're looking at 3 modes of persuasion. Ethos, pathos, logos. There's also a 4th called kairos. Ethos is basically credibility, and it refers to the author's credibility as well as the credibility of any source that they reference. So for instance, you would not take a mechanic's opinion about toothpaste the way you would a dentist's opinion about toothpaste, because a mechanic doesn't have the credibility to lend you that advice. Same thing with, you would not take your grocery store clerk's diagnosis about having COVID-19 the same way you would go into Summit urgent care and having a test and having a doctor there tell you you're positive or negative. So ethos is the credibility of the speaker or the credibility of the different voices that they bring in to lend themselves credibility. So if the mechanic tells you, well, I was speaking to my dentist earlier today and he said that Colgate is his preferred toothpaste, then the mechanic is borrowing the dentist's credibility to lend his own point of view credibility. And that's one way that we do it. Pathos is Greek for suffering or experience. And pathos is how a writer uses emotional appeals, anything that makes you feel strongly about something. So in a way, knowing that Helen Keller was blind is part of the appeal that she uses to be a more effective writer. Just the fact that the audience knew that. They were going to be more willing to listen to her because they knew what she had overcome in order to achieve all that she had achieved. But within a text, she might also write about the pain or the agony or the joy and exhilaration or the sadness in a way that also brings those emotions out in us. And that's called pathos. So you want to look, as you're reading, you want to look for examples of how writers do this. Logos, Greek for the word, in a way is essentially an appeal to logic, but it's also a logical structure within a text. So it's often using reason, using facts and figures, using data to support a claim, using a study to support a claim, but it also refers to the logical consistency of a document as a whole. So if somebody sort of jumps around from one idea to another and their piece doesn't really cohere, then it lacks a logical structure. But if it does, if it's very organized in how an idea is presented, how it goes from first I'm going to make this claim, and once I've made that claim and gotten you to agree with that claim, then I'm going to make this next claim that's contingent upon the first claim. If a text is built that way, then the author's using logos to convince you of their point of view, to persuade you. And also kairos involves timing and opportunity. So it is standing up at the right time to say the right thing. So for instance, we've got a lot of protests going on right now. There are protests happening downtown here in Noonan, and standing up and saying something and speaking out at something right now has a lot more power and momentum than, say, doing it 3 or 4 years ago, or doing it 2 or 3 years from now, or doing it at the barbershop instead of downtown where the people are gathered for the protest. So again, it's about timing and opportunity, and it does matter. So here is a piece that I read in 2013, shortly after it came out, by Roy Scranton, called Learning How to Die in the Anthropocene. And I have read very few things that affected me as deeply as this piece did. It just honestly really terrified me. Um, and he did such a good job of terrifying me that it became important to me to analyze it and figure out how he did that. How did this writer get inside my head and give me nightmares? Um, so I've included it here because I think it's just a really powerful piece. Whether or not you agree with it doesn't really matter, because my point is it makes some really good rhetorical moves, and analyzing that is useful, whether or not you agree with it. So again, we're going to look at who is the audience. What does Roy Scranton want from us? How do you know that? What's your evidence? What's your textual evidence from the document that proves this is what he wants, or that supports your claim that this is what he wants? How does he use the modes of persuasion, ethos, pathos, logos, and kairos? Can you find specific examples? So it's really important when you're writing a rhetorical analysis of anything to find specific examples from the text, quotations that you can use to support whatever claim you've made. Now, you don't have to use a whole paragraph of text. You can use a sentence or a few phrases, but you want to show, if an author is using imagery, you want to specifically show what that imagery is, and then you want to break it down. If an author is using specific diction or word choice in a way that gives something a different meaning, then you want to use that. So for example, here's a really loaded word, thug, right? Thug has become a word that has the connotation of really honestly being racist. But if you look it up in the dictionary, the denotation doesn't necessarily mean that. It doesn't necessarily have a racial definition. But we all know now that it's often used in a racist way. So that's the connotation of the word. So you want to look at how the language an author has chosen loads the meaning, gives it emotional weight, or an allusion to something else. I could think of some other examples, but you're just going to trust me on this, that when you see a word that you have an emotional response to, there's probably a connotation that is worth talking about in your essay. So don't shy away from that. You want to be very specific and precise. You want to look at what's the real definition of it, but what's the cultural connotation of it, and you want to talk about that because that's analysis. Let's see. Ethos, what makes human an interesting or credible voice? How do sources that they use lend them credibility? Pathos, how do you feel when you read the work? So stay sensitive all the way through to emotions, and that's why we do our free writing. So if you read something and it just really pisses you off or it gives you a spark of joy, write that down and see if you can unpack what it is in the language that made that happen. When you do that, you're engaging in the act of analysis. And logos, how does he use information, ideas, and other sources to build his case? So in this exercise, I'm talking specifically about the Royce Scranton piece, but take all of these questions and apply them specifically to the piece you have chosen to write about. So, rhetorical analysis. This is just sort of repeating all of those things. What is the thesis? What's the overall argument that the author presents? What did the author choose to study and why? What is the writer's purpose? To inform, to persuade, to criticize? What's the audience? How did the writer arrange their ideas? How does the writer use diction? Does the writer use dialogue? So if there's any dialogue or quotations from anywhere else, what's that doing there? How is it functioning to persuade you? So that's the central question. How are all the moves that the writer has made functioning to persuade you to agree with their point of view? That's the question you're going to be asking all the way through. Are there any important terms repeated or ideas repeated? Is there a repetitive phrase that runs through? So this happens a lot in poetry or creative writing. What is the sentence structure of text? Are there fragments or run-ons? So my job is to tell you not to write fragments or run-ons in your essays, but other types of writers with other purposes may use them very purposefully to change the speed of the information they're sending at you, or a fragment to create a sense of urgency. And that's what you want to do. You want to be analytical. If they've chosen to use a fragment, how did that fragment function to change the nature of the text or to change how the text might influence you? And do they use punctuation to create an effect? So are they using exclamation points? Are they using semicolons? Are they using ellipsis? Like, what are they doing to draw out an idea, to add drama to an idea, to change how the language influences you? So that is my quick lecture, 18 and a half minutes on rhetorical analysis. I'm also going to post this soapstone, which is another document that one of my students shared with me, and another way of thinking about the same idea, how to analyze a text, how to look at how the language is functioning to persuade you. So write it on your hand if you need to, but the central question here is how. How do the moves that the writer made with their tools, which were very simply words and punctuation, ordered in a certain way, how did all that function to create a persuasive text? And then in your conclusion, you can tell me whether or not they succeeded. And I also would like you to tell me what the cultural significance is. Why does it matter in the bigger picture? So the way I like to look at this, we're going to end up with a 22-minute lecture, but in your intro, you are looking very narrowly in, like the V of an hourglass coming in like this. You're looking in just very specifically and narrowly on the text. And in the body of the paper with your body paragraphs, you're going to stay very focused on all of that. But when you get to the conclusion, you're at the bottom of the hourglass and you're looking out at the broader culture and you're saying, why does this matter? So what? Can this really change anything? Is this something I would want to share with people to influence them or help them or change their mind about something? Can it make a difference? So that's what I want to see in your conclusions of your rhetorical analysis. So thank you very much. I will post a quiz on Wednesday afternoon at some point from this lecture, and I appreciate all of you. I'm reading some great essays, and I appreciate all of you. Have a great night.